Unlike the parliamentary process, it's argued that referendums don't allow for compromise, the blunt yes or no instruments, even though they are on specific issues. How would you respond to this?
When it comes to voting on a referendum, it's true that you have to vote yes or no on it, and it's beyond the point where you can have a discussion. But that's true, frankly, as well when the legislature votes. At some point, a decision has to be made on the option that's before you, and you have to go yes or no on it. Before the initiative happens, though, there's very typically a tremendous amount of negotiation. Typically, sponsors will go to the legislature, the government beforehand, and say, here's an issue that we're concerned about. Can we work something out? Votes typically don't want to initiate initiatives and referendums unless they can't get some sort of action from the government itself, because it's very expensive to do it. So there's a period where compromise can happen beforehand. Often there's multiple groups that are interested in sponsoring a measure, and they may have a discussion amongst themselves and come out with something that they believe meets their needs. In larger states, or when a campaign has money, there will be some vetting with focus groups and so forth to try to understand what the voters want. So there's a process before the measure actually comes to a vote, where there's plenty of opportunities to fine tune and change it. But of course, when you vote on something, you have to vote on what's before you.
I think we have to accept that this is probably a fair criticism. Referenda are a question, a simple proposition that is put forward. But I'd point out that normally it is one single proposition, and so therefore having a discussion around one single proposition I don't think is problematic. It's the nuance, it's the behind the scenes that has to go on to implement law changes that I think does create some element of challenge with referenda. However, I think we need to accept democracy is not a perfect system. What we're trying to do as best as we can is make sure it is a perfect system that does ultimately give us a country that New Zealanders participate in, a country that's heading in the direction that New Zealanders want it to go, and a country that New Zealanders genuinely feel valued and they can belong to. So while this is probably a valid criticism, it certainly doesn't take away from the fact that a referenda, while a blunt tool, is nonetheless still a very valid tool in a modern democracy. And I'd point out that, the implementation of whatever the proposal is gives government the opportunity to fine-tune some of that detail behind the scenes. Yes, they've got to deliver on the basic proposition, but the mechanisms and the sort of the subtle political nuances behind the scenes, well, they can work that out. No one's trying to tell them how to do that. So I think it's not a major fault, but it probably is the one thing about referendums that I think it has some validity to question whether or not they can always be subtle or work conveniently with existing laws on related.
First of all, that comment is made obviously without any culture of referendums. If you have a culture of referendums, for example, most obviously in Switzerland, then before you even get to a referendum, there is an element of compromise in the parliamentary process, which they call referendum proofing, in an attempt to build it towards a consensus. And similarly in Scotland, at the moment we can see that the debate is setting up possible outcomes after the referendum that would be called compromises. So I think this is not a far-sighted enough comment. They are simple instruments, but they do have a place in a modern democracy, and I would go as far as to say they can enrich a representative democracy.
Well, I think in Switzerland, for example, they have a mechanism which is called a counter-proposal. So Parliament, if it has passed a law that people don't like, Parliament can put forward a compromise bill, which will then be voted on. So in some ways, the places where they have most direct democracy, most referendums, they actually have mechanisms for consensus. It also ensures a consensus between the elite and the people. So if you take Switzerland as an example, then Switzerland is known as a consensus democracy, or Konkordanzdemokratie in their language, which is basically a system which is designed to ensure consensus, not just consensus between the people, which you have by often putting forward compromise bills, but also consensus between the elites and the people who elect them. So countries that have a lot of referendums also tend to be countries where you have compromise. There are relatively few referendums in Britain where we have a majoritarian political system, where whoever has a majority in Parliament, not necessarily on people, can ram anything through Parliament. Other countries in Europe, for example, Denmark, have many political parties. They have a consensus system of government, and they often have referendums.
My response to that is the last 30 years of government in New Zealand. And as our permanent slide down the economic and social performance ladder of the world goes on, you will nevertheless have members of Parliament who will have made that statement to you. And my response is, well, is that the way it's worked in practice? There's no doubt that if we had used referendum properly, then the widespread asset sales from this country and the massive foreign ownership that's taken over this country and the change in the share market from 19% foreign owned to now 72% foreign owned would not have happened. The people who make up the argument that you just